Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Long's Lectures in Anatomy and Physiology. I'm Professor Long. As you guys know, we're in this coronavirus shutdown, so my face-to-face class has been switched to online, and because of this short amount of time that we have and the delays that have gone on, we are trying to get these videos cranked out. So I don't have time to learn all the software. I'm not a real computer guy, so I'm doing these crude videos very quickly to get them out to my students. They're all single take. So I'm doing the best I can to try to be as clear and concise as possible. They're not coming the way that I like, but I guess they're good enough. The students have been sending me some nice messages. I'm doing this at home in my dining room, so every now and then if I look off, there might be a kid or a dog or a cat doing something. I get distracted. I might fumble on my words or lose my train of thought a little bit. Please bear with me. I'm doing the best I can in the time frame that I got. I wish I could go to an isolated studio and do some really nice videos and everything. Nonetheless, this video is intended for students taking my Human Anatomy and Physiology 1 course at Del Mar College. We are following along in my note set. I'm going to be on page 89. We're going to talk about what a nerve plexus is, and we're going to talk about reflexes. It's an important concept, especially for a lot of you guys in nursing, OTA and PTA. You're going to be dealing with a lot of this neuro stuff for sure. So if you want to follow along in the note set, all the information is written there for you. I'll be putting out a worksheet from this note set that you'll have to fill in some blanks and work on. It's going to help you focus on those concepts that I want you to pay attention to. The spinal cord, as you saw in the first video on the spinal cord, is not too complex as far as the anatomy and the layout. It gets very complex when we start dealing with the input and the output from the spinal cord, the afferent or sensory information coming in and those pathways, and the efferent or motor pathways out. They're a little bit crazy in how they go. And one of the things I would really like for y'all to focus on from the last video, which is the second one on the spinal cord, which is all the motor and sensory pathways, is where does the dorsal ramus monitoring? Posterior wall. What is the ventral ramus monitoring? Front sides and limbs, or anterior wall, lateral wall, and the limbs. The autonomic ganglion is monitoring, or the autonomic nerve is carrying information in from the entire ventral body cavity. It's also going to carry some axons out to the ventral body cavity. Know that all visceral motor pathways have to go to the autonomic ganglion first. If they're going to go out to the viscera of the back, then they go out the dorsal ramus. If they go to the viscera of the front sides and limbs, out the ventral ramus. If they're going to go to the thoracic cavity, then they stop at the autonomic ganglion, and the postganglionic fiber will go out the autonomic nerve. All of the synapses utilize acetylcholine except for the autonomic nerve going to the thoracic viscera uses adrenaline to increase heart rate, increase breathing rate, dilate airways. If we're going to go to the abdominopelvic viscera, then the neuron does not stop at the autonomic ganglion. The preganglionic neuron comes from the lateral gray horn out the ventral root, all the way out the white ramus, the autonomic nerve, all the way out to the wall of the ganglion and the wall of the target organ, the intramural ganglion. Now, I'm going to get into a little bit more detail on thoracolumbar and craniosacral. So all of you guys that know this stuff backwards and forwards, if you're going to send me some criticism of, well, it's not really like that. You didn't talk about the sympathetic chain ganglia and the collateral ganglia and the vagus nerve and craniosacral, thoracolumbar, all this terminology. I'm going to explain all that in the end. I was trying to set the premise, and then we're going to learn the differences later. Okay? One of the things that, sorry, I had to text my wife back. One of the things that we need to talk about is what a nerve plexus is. So if I took a section of spinal cord, and let's just say the cervical region, I have all these dorsal root and ventral roots coming together, and I have all these nerves, these spinal nerves. And on occasion, different levels of the spinal cord will have to go to the same location. Let's say I'm going to go to location 1 over here, some part of the body. Well, If all of these nerves are receiving input or from that location or sending motor commands out to that location, I don't want to have every nerve have branches going to multiple places. So what happens is they'll all sort of meet up at a little hub, and then they can send axons out from there to multiple locations together. So I might have 4 of these nerves sending axons out to location 1, 2 of them going here, and 2 of them going here. So all of these nerves kind of get woven together into a network. Well, the word plexus means network, essentially. So we call this a plexus, a collection of nerves where they all meet up and then send information out. And if you're following along in my note set, at the top of page 89, it explains all of that. It says that a plexus is a network of nerves that innervate a specific region of the body. So, one of the things that's going to happen is we're going to have several different plexi all up and down the spinal cord. We're going to talk about the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus. We'll talk about the lumbar and the sacral plexi. Okay? So, if you follow along in my notes set, I have a little table here on page 89. The cervical plexus has a bunch of nerves that are going to innervate parts of your neck, obviously in the cervical region. But one of the major nerves that comes out of the cervical plexus is going to go down and innervate the diaphragm. As you know, the diaphragm keeps you breathing. The nerve that goes to the diaphragm is called the phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve innervates your diaphragm, keeps you breathing. It comes out of the cervical plexus. So you need to know the cervical plexus innervates a lot of the muscles of the neck, but one of the structures it innervates also is the diaphragm. And if you look at the cervical nerves, if we were to start counting the cervical nerves, see 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. There's actually a little saying in emergency medicine that says, and if you're going to be EMT paramedic or you're going to work in an emergency room, you'll hear this: C3, 4, and 5 keep the diaphragm alive. It's a little saying that they teach in emergency medicine. C3, 4, 5 keeps the diaphragm alive. So very often you might hear someone breaking their neck and dying pretty instantaneously or within a few minutes. If you break your neck and you shear the roots of nerves 3, 4, and 5, where the roots of the phrenic nerve are, then you're not going to be able to breathe and you can pass away. If you break your neck and you don't shear 3, 4, and 5, then the diaphragm can still be functioning and you're perfectly okay, or you might have some other paralysis or other issues and other nerves have been torn, but you're not going to stop breathing. Okay? So know that the phrenic nerve comes out of the cervical plexus. The cervical plexus innervates a lot of the neck muscles and throat muscles, but also C3, 4, 5. Those nerves come through the plexus and they go out the phrenic nerve to your diaphragm. Some interesting information there. All right. So the next plexus we're going to talk about is the brachial plexus. Now the brachial plexus, since you should know by now, if you don't, you need to really consider retaking this course. The brachial region is the upper arm. So the brachial plexus is going to innervate your arm. And it has a lot of muscles for the shoulder girdle and for the upper part of your arm. And then there's 2 other nerves that branch out of the brachial plexus. And if you remember, when you look at your forearm, your radius is on your thumb side, and so there's a radial nerve that comes out of that plexus that innervates this side, and then there's an ulnar nerve coming off the other side. Okay, your pinky side. Remember, you thumb a right on your radius, smell your pinky, PU, pinky ulnar. So the ulnar nerve is running on this side of your forearm. The radial nerve is running over here. One of the things that we know is that the radial nerve innervates a lot of the extensor muscles of the wrist. So lifting your wrist up like this into extension or hyperextension. The ulnar nerve does a lot of the flexor muscles. So if someone can actually push down on their wrist really hard, but they're real weak pulling up, then you know there might be damage to the radial nerve. Okay. because the extensors aren't functioning properly. Now, if the extensors are normally strong, but the flexors are weak, maybe there's damage to the ulnar nerve or at the spinal cord where the roots of these nerves are coming off towards the brachial plexus. So you need to know the brachial plexus innervates your shoulder girdle and arm, and the radial nerve which comes out of that plexus does the extensor muscles, radial extension, ulnar flexion. We used to say this, ER-FU. ER, extensor radial, FU, flexor ulnar. That's how we remembered it. All right, so now let's go to the next plexus. That's the information you need to know about that plexus for my class, okay? The lumbar plexus, which is in your lower back, is going to innervate a lot of your thigh region, okay? The upper part of your leg. One of the major nerves that comes out of it is called the femoral nerve, or some people say femoral nerve. Well, femoral means where your femur is. It's the thigh region, okay? The sacral plexus, so this is lumbar plexus, contains the femoral nerve, which goes to the femoral region, your thigh area. The sacral nerve goes to the lower leg. The crus and the sura, or your calf and your shin. And two of the nerves that are going to run through there that come out of the sacral plexus, one of them is called the sciatic nerve. If you have problems with your back and you've heard of sciatica, that is pain down your leg. It can cause things like foot drop and problems because it innervates your lower leg and the muscles that control your ankle and your foot. So know that the sciatic nerve for the lower leg comes out of the sacral plexus. There's one other nerve that comes out of there that's important. Called the pudendal nerve. The pudendal nerve innervates both the anal and urethral sphincters. So, when someone damages the lumbar plexus, if they can't control, I dropped something and then I knocked over the old marker board I used to use. The anal and the urethral sphincters are sphincter muscles that the anal sphincter obviously holds waste in, and the urethral sphincter and the urethra, which holds urine in, are partially under voluntary control. There is part of an involuntary and voluntary. The internal anal and urethral sphincters are under involuntary control. You can't control those. And when the bladder is full, or when the rectum and colon are starting to fill and feel pressure, then there's an autonomic reflex that will naturally start to relax the internal sphincters. And that's when you have to go, you better get somewhere to release this stuff or it's going to embarrass you. So you have some control over the external anal and urethral sphincters, and that is through the pudendal nerve. So if people damage the sacral region, they can have problems with their feet. And if they damage the roots of the pudendal nerve, they can have problems controlling their bladder. They would have bladder incontinence. They have to have a catheter, and they can't go to the restroom and control it because it just leaks out of them all the time. Or they may have to have a colostomy bag where they stick a tube into the colon and let the feces leak into a bag, and it has to simply be emptied. Okay. One other thing before I get to the reflexes is I want to talk about two things. So if we're talking about from a person's head, all the way down from their upper limbs to the lower limbs. As you know, the spinal cord is going to be coming down like this, okay? If we damage the spinal cord somewhere up high, I would cut off communication of all four limbs with the brain. That leads to a term called quadriplegia. Quadra from four, and plegia. A quadriplegic, someone who has quadriplegia, is someone who cannot control or move all four limbs. They're paralyzed in all four limbs. Usually if the damage is lower, then you have someone that would be a paraplegic, or they would have paraplegia, meaning paralysis to a pair of limbs, two. Quadra is all four are paralyzed. Paraplegic would only be two limbs. Almost always, paraplegics have lost use of the legs. I do know of one rare instance where someone damaged the nerves coming in, and I read about this when I was a neuro student in graduate school, where there was a paraplegic of someone who couldn't use their arms, but their legs were functioning, which was kind of odd, but it's because of the unique type of damage they did to the motor output to their arms and the sensory input to the arms only. They damaged just specific. It was a freak situation. I can't even remember the details. But usually when we say paraplegic, you've cut off communication to the lower limbs. Quadriplegic means you've cut off communication to all four limbs. Excuse me. Finally, reflexes. So let's get to the reflexes. Now this is where it gets a little confusing. This information is pretty straightforward. Part of the reflexes is pretty confusing, so bear with me, staring at my back for a moment, and let's talk about this, okay? So now, I'm going to draw a little person over here, arms, legs, just a small diagram, okay? And imagine if we could draw them in half. Now, if I were to look at the spinal cord, I'm going to draw a simplified version of the spinal cord. I'm not even going to put all that stuff in. I'm just going to do this, okay? We have the dorsal root ganglion, the ventral root, and we have all the spinal cord here, okay? So, we have the gray matter and all the horns here, okay? Now, we're going to have things that are called reflexes. The definition of a reflex is an automatic motor response that is designed to preserve homeostasis. So, any reflex is an automatic motor response. Our body does it without us consciously controlling it. These are all involuntary, so to speak. Or some of them are voluntary, but they're at such a low level of consciousness that they kind of bypass the brain temporarily. We automatically do it to protect our body, to protect us, and then we figure out what happened. It's the old theory, sort of shoot first and then ask questions later. If someone's attacking you, you might shoot first and then figure out, okay, what was going on. So it's kind of what our spinal cord does. It's what our nervous system does to protect us from damage first and then figure out what exactly was going on. And I'll give you a quick example. I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but the house that I used to live in before, our shower had a hot and a cold faucet. And turn on the hot water, wait for it to get hot, and then you temper it with cold water to get the temperature just right. If you turn on the hot water and then you get distracted by something and forget that you never turned on the cold water and you go to test the temperature, you stick your hand in and pull your hand out. And then you feel the heat sensation set in. Well, that's the shoot first, ask questions later. You pulled your hand out, and then a fraction of a second later, you realize, ooh, that's hot. So what we did was we bypassed the brain through the spinal cord to get a motor response at the same time that the information was going to the brain so we could figure out what happened and what to do about it in the long term. So reflexes are quick automatic motor responses designed to preserve homeostasis, okay, to protect us. The pathway that they follow is called a reflex arc. Some of them are simple, some of them are complex. But if we look at a reflex arc, a simple reflex arc would simply be this pathway, okay? And I hope you can see this diagram pretty well. Let's say I have a sensation. I stick my hand, I touch a hot stove and I pull my hand away. Well, we're going to have a neuron come in that's going to be a sensory neuron. It's going to synapse in the spinal cord. And then I'm going to have some kind of central processing. And I'm going to have a motor command come right back out to the muscles or the effectors. Okay? So it's really going to give us 5 steps that are going to happen here. So we're going to detect the stimulus at a sensory receptor. This is my abbreviation for the words detect a stimulus at the sensory receptor. Okay? So we activate a sensory receptor, and then we actually activate the sensory neuron and carry the action potential into the spinal cord. So that's activation of the sensory neuron. The receptor detects it. The sensory neuron carries the signal to the central nervous system, the spinal cord itself. Then we have some kind of central processing going on, but again, this is at the spinal cord level, bypassing the brain temporarily. So there's information processing as the third step. If you're following my notes set on page 89, the steps are numbered. The fourth step is going to be activation of your motor neuron. We're going to activate the motor neuron, and the last step is we get the response at the effector. Okay, so you should know the basic steps of a reflex arc. What are the steps in correct order? Detection of the detection of a stimulus at the sensory receptor cell. We activate the sensory neuron. We do central processing, activate the motor neuron, and get the response at the effector. Okay. Now, there are some really simple reflex arcs, and there's some really complex ones. Okay. So if you go on to page 90, there's some definitions at the top, and these definitions tell us about different types of reflexes. One is called an innate reflex. Now, if we look at this word, innate, the nate comes from nature or naissance, which means birth in French. So innate are inborn reflexes. We are born with these reflexes. One good example is the blinking reflex or the suckling reflex. If you take a little baby that's pretty fresh and you touch its face, if you do this to an adult, they can keep their eyes open and stare at you like, why are you touching me? If you do it to a baby, they will blink every time because it's a reflex to protect their eyes from damage. So they're born with that blinking reflex. Or if you touch their lips, they try to suckle or chew on it. The feeding reflex. Those are inborn reflexes or innate. They develop during or prior to birth. The next one on the list is called the acquired reflexes. In acquired reflexes, in order to acquire them, you have to learn them through experience. So acquired reflexes develop after we're born and as we're experiencing life, we acquire them. Things like learning to walk. If you take a fresh baby and stand them up, boom, they fall over. So just standing up and balancing, when our body senses that we're starting to go one way, we naturally contract muscles to hold up our posture and our positioning. Walking, riding a bicycle, all of those things are acquired reflexes, your balance, so to speak. Cranial reflexes always involve cranial nerves. So as we talked about in the last quizzes, in the last section on the brain, if you hear a loud noise, you turn your head towards it. That's an auditory reflex. That's a cranial nerve. If you turn your head towards something moving in the periphery, if your pupils dilate or constrict in bright or dark light, or vice versa, those are all cranial reflexes. They involve cranial nerves. Salivation when you think about food. Spinal reflexes involve spinal nerves, and those are going to be a bunch of the ones that we're about to talk about. But they involve any kind of things like pulling your hand off a hot stove, things that involve spinal nerves. Somatic reflexes involve skeletal muscle, like pulling your hand off a hot stove. It's not only a spinal reflex, it's a somatic reflex because there's skeletal muscle involved. And then visceral reflexes involve our viscera, okay? There's a reflex that once you start chewing food and tasting it and swallowing it, your stomach starts to ramp up its activity. So even if I just start talking about food, you'll start salivating. Well, the muscle and salivary glands are smooth muscles, so that would be a visceral reflex. We're part of the digestive tract now. So anyway, you understand those definitions. Innate means you're born with it, develops prior to birth. Acquired develops after you're born through experience. Cranial involves cranial nerves. Spinal involves spinal nerves. Somatic reflexes involve skeletal muscle. And visceral or autonomic reflexes involve smooth and cardiac muscle. Okay. Now, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. And I'm going to erase my spinal cord here and redo all of this. And we're going to do this about 4 or 5 times probably. But I need you to understand some terminology. And those of you that do OTA and PTA, and even if you're going to be a nurse, you're going to deal with this when you do your neuro rotations. And those of you that do a lot of rehab are going to need to know some of this. Some reflexes involve a single synapse in the CNS. They're called monosynaptic reflexes, mono meaning one. Polysynaptic reflexes involve many synapses, several, and they're much more complex. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of monosynaptic reflex. A good example of a monosynaptic reflex would be like what we call the stretch reflex. So when you go to the doctor, if you're sitting on a table and your knee is like this, and they bang you with that little hammer on the patellar tendon, and your leg kicks out, that is a monosynaptic reflex. It's a rather simple one. I hope you can see that. My black marker is giving out. I'm going to have to start using a different color. So when it comes to our spinal cord here, and I'm not even going to draw the roots, okay? I'm just going to draw a simple spinal cord like this. What's going to happen is we're going to feel stretch in that tendon. The axon will come in. The soma lives in the dorsal root ganglion. And it's going to bypass here and synapse on a motor neuron. And that motor neuron is going to go out to your extensor muscles and fire excitedly on them. And they're going to kick and extend your leg. What happens is, if you stretch that tendon, it would be like if you're folding your leg back. If you overstretch it and tear some muscles, you would not be able to hunt or find food. And so therefore, we need to reverse that quick stretch so we fire off and extend our leg. It's considered a monosynaptic reflex because we have a single synapse going on. Okay? Now, there's another term that you should also know called ipsilateral. Ipsi comes from the same word as iso, which means same, and lateral means side. Ipsilateral reflexes means that the response, the motor response, happens on the same side of the spinal cord as the stimulus. So when they bang on your right patellar tendon, you don't kick your left leg, you kick your right leg out also. So that's also an ipsilateral reflex. It's monosynaptic because there's one synapse. It's called a stretch reflex. You bang on a tendon, and they do the same thing in your arm. And there's another one called the Babinski reflex in babies. But there's a number of monosynaptic reflexes, and they're always ipsilateral. Okay. Now, polysynaptic reflexes are where it gets complex. Now, polysynaptic reflexes are going to be called contralateral also. All polysynaptic reflexes are usually, well, not all of them. Polysynaptic reflexes can be ipsilateral or contralateral. And let me give you an example. Okay, so I'm going to talk about polysynaptic. And the first example that I'm going to give you of a polysynaptic reflex is called the withdrawal reflex. The withdrawal reflex is not only polysynaptic, but it is also ipsilateral, meaning that response is going to happen on the same side. If I put my right hand on a hot stove, there's no reason for me to start jerking around my left arm. I want to withdraw it from the same side, okay? So this involves the upper limbs. And this is considered to be an ipsilateral reflex because it's going to happen on the same side, but it's going to be polysynaptic. And here's why, okay? So if I put someone's hand out here, and here's the arm, and the elbow. Remember, I'm going to have muscles over here. And on one side of the arm, I'm going to have flexor muscles. On the other side of the arm, excuse me, I'm going to have the extensor muscles. So if I fire my biceps muscle, I will flex my arm. If I fire the triceps muscle, I will extend my arm. Well, in this reflex, when I withdraw my hand from a hot stove, I'm going to flex my arm. Okay? Now, here's my spinal cord. Anterior, posterior, and so on. Okay? What's going to happen is, when I sense this, the sensation, and I'm not going to draw it coming through the arm because I don't want to make this too messy, but the sensory neuron is going to come in and synapse. It's going to stimulate what's called an interneuron. An interneurons are neurons that are in between two others, inter meaning between, and they're always in the CNS. And there'll be two interneurons that fire. One's going to fire here, and then I'm going to have a motor neuron that would come out through the anterior great horn, since these are somatic motor, but it's going to come out this way. And what's going to happen is these are going to be excitatory, meaning I'm going to fire and make the muscles contract. But in order to do that, I have to make sure I inhibit the extensor muscles. And so another synapse will come around here and be inhibitory, and it's going to inhibit this muscle from firing. Now you can see why they're called polysynaptic. There's a bunch of synapses going on here. Okay? The entire effect is going to happen on the same side of the body. So we call this a withdrawal or a flexor reflex. I'm going to flex my arm or withdraw my arm. And I have to excite. This is why we call it a flexor reflex. I excite the flexor muscles, and I'm going to inhibit the extensor muscles. So the withdrawal reflex is also called the flexor reflex, okay? Because we're going to flex our arm. It is polysynaptic. I'm going to excite the flexor muscles. I'm going to inhibit the extensor muscles, okay? It's all ipsilateral. Now we got a more complex one to do after that. So make sure you get that information down. It's all written on page 90 in my note set. Now we're going to do the last one that I want to cover, which is called the crossed extensor reflex. This one involves the legs. If you're walking through the house and you step on a Lego or kick a couch or a table, you want to flex or withdraw the side that was damaged. But you have to extend the opposite side so that you have a foot to stand on while you hop around and cuss. So it's called a crossed extensor reflex. Got all this down. I'm going to erase this. And let's do one more polysynaptic reflex. And the crossed extensor reflex is going to be even more complex than this one. And it's going to be contralateral. Okay? So I'm going to use a different term here. This is polysynaptic, but it is considered to be contralateral. Contralateral means opposite side. Contra means opposite or against, so to oppose. So in a contralateral, I made that all one word, didn't I? Contralateral reflexes always involve a response on the opposite side of the body from the side of the stimulus. If I step on a nail on this foot, I want to withdraw this one. I want to extend the opposite foot. So crossed extensor reflexes are contralateral. They involve the legs, and there's even more synapses. So look, here's a knee and a foot. Here's someone's leg, okay? Not the prettiest leg I've ever drawn, but oh well. I'm not interested in. Here's the opposite leg, okay? Now, I'm going to have my spinal cord here in the middle, okay? I hope you can see all that. It's a crude drawing, but you'll get this. Now the stimulus, I'm not going to have the neuron go through the leg because I got to do some stuff here. But let's say you step on a nail or you kick a table or you step on a hot coal or something at a barbecue and you're barefoot. The sensory neuron is going to come in and it's going to fire. There's going to be a number of interneurons. One interneuron is going to be excitatory, and it's going to cause excitement of the flexor muscles. It's the same thing as your arm. You're going to flex the leg on the same side as the damage. So we excite the flexor on the same side of the damage, and you flex your foot or lift it. That means I'm also going to have to inhibit the extensor muscles. So on the same side of the damage, I get the flexor reflex. I excite the flexors, I inhibit the extensors. Okay? But on the opposite side of the body, I'm going to have to do this. I'm going to excite the extensor muscles. This is why it's called a crossed extensor reflex. Because on the opposite side, on the contralateral side, I'm going to excite the extensor. So this is called the crossed extensor reflex. It is a polysynaptic reflex that is contralateral. I'm going to have extension on the opposite side of the damage. That means I'm also going to have to inhibit the flexor muscles on the opposite side as well. So in both of these, you need to know what's happening. So the withdrawal or flexor reflex involves the upper limbs. I'm going to excite the flexors, inhibit the extensors so that I can withdraw. Same thing happens here. On the crossed extensor reflex, on the side that the damage occurs, I'm going to excite the flexors and inhibit the extensors so that I can withdraw the foot. But if I did not have this, I may not have already transferred all my weight. If I lift my foot, I can fall. So I want to extend the leg on the opposite side so I have a leg to stand on. So I'm going to excite the extensors, crossed extensor. Got it? All right, listen, that's a lot of information, I know, but, you know, we're nearing the end. The next couple of lectures are not going to be anywhere near as difficult as these last two. So hang in there, keep pushing through, keep working the notes till you can't stand it. Do the worksheets when I get them published, and be ready for the quizzes in a week or so, okay? Today's the 23rd. I think we're taking these quizzes sometimes around the 29th or the end of the month. So you're going to have at least a week to cover these videos, and we'll start working on them and doing the worksheets before we take the quiz, all right? Thanks for watching. I hope you had as much fun as I did. See you on the flip side.